Hello, I'm Jane Frizzell, and this is Steinbrecht Sessions, where every Tuesday at 3 o'clock Eastern Time, we are going through line upon line, precept upon precept, Steinbrecht's instructions for the horseman's adage, ride your horse forward and set it straight. All great horsemen have that adage as their most singular guidepost for training, but he really spells it out beautifully in this section from pages 71 through, I think it's page 78. Yeah, 78. I think I said 75 a minute ago. 75 is spurs, 78 is the end of the chapter. 71 through 78, these 7 pages, that's what the point of this program is. And now we're on page 76. And we were talking about last week, for a couple of weeks, we talked about obedience to the spurs and what that brings about, and what their actual use is now. And then, maybe because he was talking about spurs, he then starts to talk about being good to the horse and what a true friend is and who has a heart for the horse versus people that are awful to the horses and blah, blah, blah. Not blah, blah, blah. I shouldn't say that. It is super important. The horses are our friends, and we are the horse's teacher, and then they are our friend. And we train in a friendly way that makes sense and is logical, and we're not rough with the horses. And so this long paragraph, the first big paragraph of page 76, he's expounding on that fact. So he's really highlighting the difference between good riders and the terrible ones. But we're not going to study this paragraph really closely, and here's why. Because this kind of content in 2025, now that social media is such a thing, this kind of paragraph and content is what the influencer rider culture that I call the IRC, they use this type of paragraph as content. They make it all virtue signaling, and then they say, oh, well, Steinbrecht said it and I follow him, and I'm wonderful and I love horses more than you do. And he didn't mean it for that. I know that. And he really meant it, but I am not going to dwell in it, even though it's a real paragraph. It's a big one too. I'm not going to dwell in it because of the danger of the IRC seeing this or finding the paragraph, because now I've pointed it out, and turning it into their own virtue signaling content. So we're bypassing it today to avoid triggering shallow sentimentalism, and or weaponized kindness. So the shift focus is the next paragraph. As I mentioned, he says, as I mentioned once before. He didn't mention it once before. He mentioned it like 3 times a page for like the last 40 pages. As I mentioned once before, he says the elevation of the forehand must not be forced. Rather, with correct work of the seat and leg aids, the horse will offer it on its own. It's fruit of forward riding. The forehand coming up is fruit of forward riding, and that is what is called elevation of the forehand, relative elevation, because it's relative to the engagement and use of the hindquarters. The elevation of the forehand is relative to the engagement and use of the hindquarters. That's why he says with correct work of the seat and leg aids, the horse offers it. It just is a consequence of forward riding. When the horse has a desire to carry and is doing so, his withers will come above his croup as he does that. It's not something like we do. We ride to that, but we don't do it. And the reason why I'm making this very specific note that we don't do it, it's a consequence. The uphillness of the horse is a consequence of the correct forward straight riding. And I would say a little bit of the unifying effect of the bearing rein, but that's a separate day. We'll talk about that on another day. The elevation of the forehand is relative to the efficacy of the hindquarters being worked correctly, activated and working correctly. So the horse will initially look to the forehand for a way out. That's when we get a horse going, and then he's like, oh my God, this is kind of hard work. And he'll lean onto his forehand. But then we say, oh no, my darling, you must not do that. You are going to be able to do all of this with considered exercises and developing you properly. You're going to be able to not only carry yourself from behind, but also allow your hindquarters to carry your forehand. So I do want to point out, though, that there is an unfortunately phrased translation here when he talks about when it's being ridden forward, front, back to front from the rear, but the horse we prevent the horse by our guidance of the forehand. We prevent him from using the forehand as a leg, as the fifth leg. But we don't stop his forehand with our hand to do that. We make sure that we keep the forehand alive, united, and displaceable in the forward going, so he doesn't make the obvious mistake. Any intelligent creature would go, oh, this is hard. It's hard work for my butt. I think I'll use my front to assist with the going. Our hand says, oh no, my darling. And I keep the bit in front of them, so they never he really should never get to his bit that he's going to because it's in front of him. They certainly never bring it nearer to him. I hope you're really hearing what I just said. Okay, next paragraph. The rider must regulate this elevation. Remember, this is relative elevation. It's good to think of it in those two words, relative elevation, relative to the efficacy and activity of the hindquarters. The rider must regulate the relative elevation and be strict in observing that the position of the head relative to the neck, as well as the position of the cervical vertebrae relative to one another, is always correct. Now, this is a very thorny thing that I'm going to try to guide us through. There's very big mistakes being made by people that want to arrange the position of the head relative to the neck and also position the cervical vertebrae, the vertebrae of the neck, before the horse is going straight forward but from behind. And we've begun to organize the more broad and dense vertebrae of the other sections of the spine. So it's, I think Phyllis talks about the fishing pole, like you got to have the base of the fishing pole in your hand and then it gets skinny at the end. But too often it gets reversed and people try to you can't hold a fishing pole with the skinny little end. So I've got to get the base of the spine and the section of the spine I sit on up to the wither. So at the withers, that's where after the withers is neck vertebrae, is cervical vertebrae. And then at the end of the neck vertebrae that I don't really, I mean, I think the horses organize themselves, but I'll get back to that. The end of the vertebrae is the atlanto-occipital junction, the pole. So when we're fishing on the beach, we put the base of the fishing pole in the little thingy, right? And then the skinny end's out there going towards the fish. I don't obsessively try to place the skinny end of my pole. Oh, if I put it at that altitude, surely a gigantic tuna will bite. No, no. It's the pole is set in place, and that end is almost out on its own in a way. And listen, I don't place the pole. I teach the horse to go to his bit and follow his bit with his body, mind, and heart. Like all of you, follow that bit. And it's out in front of him. And he's also been taught to keep his jaw loose. That loose jaw is how that junction of the skull to the last neck vertebrae is staying loose and free. The entire spine, pole through dock, excuse me, cancel that. The entire spine, dock to pole. Remember the fishing pole too. Butt end to skinny end, dock to pole. I am responsible for, if my horse is ridden straight, the very important feature of a straight horse is that his entire spine is covering the line of travel. So entire means all of it. That means every vertebrae, dock through pole. Has to cover the line of travel. That is how the neck can be finished. That is how we finish. I don't obsess about the connection. I don't obsess about the pole. I obsess about the line of travel and the going on it. I think you guys are hearing me. So the uniform, so there is a correct, for every horse has a slightly different anatomy. There is an ideal arrangement of this final section of spine, the cervical section of the spine. Every horse and in every stage of its development, there is an ideal way to arrange that. But the way I arrange that is by forward straight riding to a gorgeous, perfect contact that he calls normal. I had to go across the world to learn this gorgeous, beautiful contact that is commensurate to the engagement. My rein length is adjusted commensurate to the engagement and activity of the hindquarters. Then I have the uniform soft contact with the reins. When I ride from behind, and my rein management and their length is commensurate to the engagement and activity of the hindquarters, that decides my uniform soft contact. That is my measure. This ideal perfect contact that is commensurate to the activity and engagement of the hindquarters is the normal contact, or should be normal contact. But there are not very many riders these days who have been trained to ride to this normal contact that is determined by the back to front, forward, straight riding. The way I was taught by the major, who, who also had the best teachers in the world, the way that we do it in this program, I should say, and I learned it from the major, is that every time I'm going to engage my horse on one side, I loosen first of all. And then he engages. And then I shorten my inner rein, inside, meaning the side of the engagement, commensurate to that engagement, so that my normal contact is constant. Because if he's more engaged on the inside, literally the distance between the stifle and the ring of the snaffle is reduced. I've got to adjust contact for that. That was a big freebie I just gave to some of you. Maybe you've never heard about it before. And it is a thing that has to be the length of the rein is a very big part of the education of the hand. And this normal contact that he's talking about, normal contact, look at Ben Verndl's contact. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I expect from the riders in this program. Contact that precise. Okay. So, okay, I think I've covered, I made some notes. I think I've covered now that we're skipping the virtue content source, this mine here, that people will want to mine the virtue signaling content. Skipping that. Shift of focus, we're talking about the Aufrichtung, relative elevation, and riding horses through back to front. And now we've talked about normal contact, which is uniform, soft, when preceded by forward going. And, oh, here's a note. So the major described this normal contact, this connection of the rein between the hand and mouth, as a spider web rein. That my rein, I treat it as if it is the consistency and delicateness of a spider web. But I must, a spider web strand. That's how careful I am with it. And I therefore shorten my inner rein. If I'm engaging right, whoops. If I'm engaging right, I shorten my right rein. I've got to keep that spider web, the ideal length, so that it's flat, motionless, and weightless. Motionless, because if it's jiggling, it means that either the hand is stiff or the mouth. And certainly not flopping, because that means I'm not connected to the mouth as ideally as I could be. And I ride on the weight of my rein, but it is a connector, especially my snaffle. I like a little sag and a curve. And I think that's right, but not in a snaffle. Okay. That rein is weightless, flat, and motionless, but it is alive. This is not lightness. Lightness isn't empty, and lightness isn't floppy. And we don't wiggle the bit with our pinky I saw someone teaching this to 38,000 people last week, doing this with the hand. I mean, there is a piece of metal in that horse's mouth. We need to remember that. Okay, so here's my summary about the spine is the main event, not the pole. That it's easy, it becomes sort of intuitive or obvious how to finish that last section of the cervical vertebrae and that tiny endpoint of the pole. The horse, he finishes his own pole. It is a thing, it's important, but it is not, it is fruit of the effort. It is fruit of the forward straight going plus the normal, which is actually very rare and ideal contact. The height of the pole that delicate atlanto-occipital junction is not the key to collection. It is not the key to collection. The pole is not like the throne of correctness. Real elevation, uphillness, comes from croup to withers, not from some configuration that I fiddle with the tip of my fishing pole. Real riding begins beneath the croup, and we send it in the direction of the going. And the horse, you know what, think about this. The horse is looking where he's going. His pole's the highest point. His brain is working too. He's not just giving in to some fiddling. Okay. And so the pole, it is important, but it is like a node in node, like as a point of connection, like as in a junction or intersection, like in anatomy or tech. It's passive. It receives transmits, but it's not a source of power. In anatomy, I'm reading now, nodes are delicate signal points, not load-bearing, not central, not athletic. To treat the pole like it controls the horse is like mistaking a nerve for a muscle. I want to take us back now to pages 72 and 73. And he tells us about this our fantastic responsibility to the horse's spine. The bend, or the shape, must expect the shape of the line of travel, which is either a bend or a straight line, must extend over the entire spinal column so as not to have an adverse effect on the horse's way of going. The spinal column, the entire thing, dock through pole, forms the firm basis to which the remaining parts of the skeleton are attached, either directly or indirectly. The skeleton, in turn, not only serves as a firm support for the muscles, but also as a protection for the precious internal organs. In the center of the vertebrae, of the entire spinal column, not just the neck, in the center of the vertebrae, dock through pole, well protected as an extension of the brain, extends the spinal cord, which provides the entire body with the nervous system, the organ of sensation and animation. The direction of this main stem, therefore, also primarily determines the activity of the individual limbs during movement. To work it correctly, namely make it flexible, is one of the main tasks of the trainer. So no sport, no athletic venture in any type of world focuses on the fragile neck joints instead of the powerful structural levers of the trunk and hips. it's a very big mistake. So the throat latch, pull, and cervical vertebrae, and we're going to talk about this again next week because he's going to talk about this final connection, withers to bit or withers to pull. But it's really a connection of the entire animal, the whole horse. We're not just finishing a little section. The whole animal, the whole horse is involved in this. And the horse and rider are together involved in this. The throat, latch, pull, and cervical vertebrae are important, but not load-bearing, not prime movers, and they are not a means to the true athletic mechanisms of the horse. They are fruit at the end. They're icing on the cake. So even if you're very light, if you're fiddling with this area, instead of getting the hind legs to work through your not training, you're dicking around. We will return to this withers, pull, finishing contact, and this what he calls normal contact, which is actually very rare and ideal these days, but is expected by the rider trainers who are, well into this program now and training. Contact is a product of the motion through the body. The whole spine is your responsibility.